You're listening to Behind the Sermon from Three Crosses Church. Hello and welcome to Behind the Sermon. My name is Tom Richards, and this week we are looking at a question that appears in this week's text and all throughout John's Gospel. Who are the Jews? John 1:19 says, "Now this was John's testimony when," and then there are these words which literally translate as the Jews of Jerusalem. Then it goes on, sent priests and Levites to ask him who he was. So now this was John's testimony when the Jews of Jerusalem sent priests and Levites to ask him who he was. At first, this language can sound a bit strange because John, Jesus, and John the Baptist are all Jewish. So why does John speak about the Jews as though they are a separate group? To answer that, we need to think about both the historical context and what we call the literary context, or the text itself. Historically speaking, the term Jews was often used by Gentiles to describe Jewish people, or by Jewish people living outside Judea. People living in Jerusalem would more naturally think of themselves as Israelites. So if John is writing from somewhere like Ephesus, where church tradition says he ministered later in life, then this language itself makes sense. But there's still something more going on. John regularly speaks about the Jews with a certain sense of distance. He never places Jesus' disciples into that category, even though they're Jewish too. So the question becomes, how is John specifically using this term in his gospel? The immediate context gives us some clues. So firstly, the Jews in this passage clearly have authority. They're able to send an official delegation to investigate John the Baptist. Secondly, they're connected to Jerusalem. And thirdly, they must be connected to the temple because the delegation includes priests and Levites. Then in verse 24, we get another detail. So we find out there that Pharisees were present in this delegation as well. So who are these groups? The Levites were the tribe of Israel that's set apart for general service in the temple. The priests were a smaller group within the Levites. They were descendants of Aaron, who carried out specific priestly duties. So in this passage, the priests and Levites are really functioning together as representatives of the temple establishment. This also explains their interest in John's ministry, since they're concerned with purification rites. Someone baptizing would naturally attract their attention. The Pharisees were different. Unlike the priests and Levites, their identity wasn't based on ancestry, but on interpretation and devotion to the law. So they emerged from movements committed to preserving Jewish faithfulness during periods of foreign oppression. They were known for careful observance of the law and for developing oral traditions about how the law should be obeyed in daily life. And so because Pharisee is not kind of an ancestral identity, a person could technically be both a Pharisee and a Levite, though that was uncommon. Most priests were more closely associated with the Sadducees, which is another major Jewish group at the time. So the Sadducees were centred on the temple and emphasised written scriptures, while the Pharisees were more influential in the synagogues and amongst the wider population. So when John describes a delegation made up of both priests and Levites and Pharisees, and then we put this along with the evidence of their authority and their kind of origin in Jerusalem, it points towards the Jewish establishment, and most likely the Sanhedrin, which is the council in Jerusalem where these groups were represented. Now that helps us in this passage, but we should be careful not to flatten out every use of the Jews in John's Gospel into one meaning. Not all references to the Jews are negative. After all, in John 4:22, Jesus says, "Salvation is from the Jews." Many Jews believe in Jesus throughout the Gospel. In John 11 and 12, large numbers come to faith. Even some Jewish leaders respond positively, people like Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea. And John 4:9 explicitly reminds us that Jesus himself was a Jew. However, most often, the phrase does refer to Jewish leadership, especially in opposition to Jesus. So what is John doing in all of these uses? Well, it seems that what he's doing is he's creating a distinction of identity. So John and some of his readers, maybe many of his readers, may still be ethnically Jewish, but their primary identity is now centered on Jesus Christ. That doesn't pit Christianity against the Old Testament. In fact, John's Gospel constantly presents Jesus as the fulfillment of Israel's hopes. The true children of Abraham are those who recognise Israel's Messiah. All of this matters for this passage because it helps us to understand the tone of the investigation. These questions aren't neutral. John the Baptist has become a public figure in a time of intense messianic expectation and subsequent political instability. Naturally, the Jewish authorities in Jerusalem want to know who he is and what claims he's making about himself. And that is exactly what we're going to explore in the sermon on Sunday. What questions do they ask John the Baptist? Why do they ask them? And what did John's answers reveal, not only about himself, but ultimately about Jesus Christ? I'll see you there. Three Crosses Church exists to know and glorify God by being and making disciples who love, trust and obey Jesus.